This lesson for the Cornet Project class will discuss Jews for Judaism, and namely what Jews for Judaism have to say about their God, their Jesus, and their scriptures. Their caption here, or their idea here, is their goal is keeping Jews Jewish. And here's the things that several of the things they believe. I listed it here: the myth of the resurrection, how to answer a Christian missionary, why the real Messiah is not Jesus, why Jesus didn't have to die to atone for sin, Trinity versus unity, deconstructing the virgin birth claim, and eternal Torah versus New Testament. Of course, this was quite an eye-opener for me. I first came to be aware of Jews for Jesus, of all places, while our church was on a youth trip, and I hardly ever was on those trips, but this one I was, and it was somewhere in Texas, and come across the person doing the outreach, and we began to speak, and they were talking about Jews for Jesus, and I was intrigued. They had me at the word Jews because in my culture we don't often come across people who identify themselves as Jewish and then are out actively campaigning for Jesus. But it was interesting, and it caused me to start evaluating, because I had been part of, or that is, I had been receiving resources from the Christian Research Institute, Dr. Walter Martin, who he died in 1989, and most of his work was about more aberrant theology and very unusual cults that had formed, and research on things like Catholicism, types of Protestantism, Judaism, things like that, were nothing that I had found myself directed towards. So when I came across Jews for Jesus and then found the opposite, Jews for Judaism, I thought that was quite interesting. But notice, it's easier to just let the Jews for Judaism speak in this initial lesson, and then of course I can notice how vast the assignment will be to go ahead and develop a rationale and reply and what we would call proofs in discrete mathematics. So here's the myth of the resurrection. It says, in their attempt to convert Jews, Christian missionaries promote the alleged resurrection of Jesus. And this is a quote from their website. And as the most compelling argument for their faith, and this Rabbi Michael presents a Jewish evaluation of this claim and probes the evidence provided for the resurrection. So they deny the resurrection. How to answer a Christian missionary with study guide. So, for example, as a Christian, we might have information on how to respond to Mormons when they come to your door. If they do, they don't do that much around here anymore. Or what do you do when Jehovah's Witnesses come by? And we would have information, and we would review it to make sure we have our talking points, and to be always ready to give an answer as we were taught, even from our youth. So this is a step-by-step biblical refutations. This classic counter-missionary audio recording was created to provide you with a basic understanding of the issues most commonly raised by Christian missionaries. Now, when I first heard of this, I was startled, because I just seemed so counterintuitive. It seemed to be so different than anything I had ever imagined and had considered, that people were actively working to deconstruct Christianity, and they were actually anti-Christ in every doctrine and teaching, and even advocating a different God who was not the God of the Bible, that is the one being, three persons, true and living God. So that was fascinating. The real Messiah, why he is not Jesus, is one of the items you can read on their website. If there arise a king from the house of David who meditates on the Torah, occupies himself with the commandments, as did his ancestor David, observes the precepts prescribed in the written and the oral Torah prevails upon Israel to walk in the way of the Torah and to repair its breaches and fights the battles of the Lord, it may be assumed that he is the Messiah. Now, this is something we've been taught from a child, that their expectations of the Messiah were not met by Jesus, and they consider him to have failed miserably. Now it goes on in the highlighted portion, but if he does not meet with full success or is slain, it is obvious that he is not the Messiah promised in the Torah. Now you can read more about that on their website, Jews for Judaism. Why Jesus didn't have to die to atone for sin, Trinity versus unity, what the Bible really teaches about God, deconstructing the virgin birth claim. Now they say the resurrection didn't happen, the virgin birth didn't occur, there is no such thing as the Trinity. They prefer the eternal Torah versus what they will demonstrate in their arguments, the New Testament to be. Here they're very, what we'd call aggressive in their campaigning. This one is wearing a shirt, Jews for Jesus, with obviously canceled that in their diagram. And then it says a 2-minute counter-missionary crash course. So they're unashamedly, these ones identifying as Jews for Judaism, they're unashamedly moving forward. We've had a pastor years ago that spoke of people who had the wrong message, but the right method. And he was talking about how much they go out, how much they pursue, almost in militant fashion. And he was quite startled at times, even of himself, how much we can find ourselves preoccupied with rather than occupied with getting the word out, making the disciples, and following up, and then developing our own rationale for each of us to know and understand how to give an answer and to assure that disciples are made for Christ to serve his interests. And as what we do at Landmark in Jacksonville is to assure Christ's interest that his Father receives the glory, and that's by Jesus, and that's in the ecclesia where we worship him in spirit and in truth. So here, unmasking Jews for Jesus. So they obviously have targeted Jews for Jesus and Messianic Jews. He says Jews for Jesus and Messianic Jews claim that what they're doing is 100% Jewish, the most Jewish thing anyone can do. However, calling it Jewish does not make it Jewish. Now, this is something that we also were taught, especially from the New Testament. We'll look at that as we conclude. Here's a quote by Abraham Lincoln. How many legs does a dog have if you call the tail a leg? 4. Calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. Abraham Lincoln. Jews for Jesus and Messianic Jews are following evangelical Protestant Christianity. Their beliefs are not Jewish and have no relation to Judaism. On every issue of theology, these Hebrew Christians reject the Jewish point of view and embrace the perspective of Christianity. So they make quite a demarcation. And you notice unashamedly, these Jews for Judaism call out people who identify themselves as Jews, and they say they're not Jewish ones. Well, here's what the former Jew for Judaism had to say. Romans 2:28, for he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. Philippians 3:1 through 6. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you, to me indeed is not grievous, but for you it is safe. Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision. Now, this is Paul's declaration of what he would have said of himself before he came out and acknowledged the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the righteousness of God. And he went on and said, for we are the circumcision. You notice this, us versus them. Now he's having left Judaism. He's saying we are the circumcision, which worship God in the spirit and rejoice in Christ Jesus and have no confidence in the flesh. Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. So this is the Jew of the Jews for the Judaism that he excelled in. He said, circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. Now at this point, if you go back in this presentation, you'll notice that Jews for Judaism would have considered Paul the Messiah. But notice what I highlight in yellow. He was persecuting the ecclesia, those who were called out, severed their ties, as we learned in a previous lesson. The first word in ecclesia is ek, E-K, as in EX in an exit sign, or as in the Bible book called Exodus, out from, way out from. And they severed their ties after they were blood bought in all the typology of the Old Testament. The blood was applied, they were redeemed, purchased, and now owned, and then were led out from Egypt, and then their ties were permanently severed as they were baptized when they crossed the Red Sea. And that was a permanent severance that took place. So let's move on, and we'll conclude here. But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ, and be found in him, not having mine own righteousness, which is what drives Jews for Judaism, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death. Now notice how ironic it is in the context of this presentation that for Jews, for Judaism today, they would have to say that Paul met all the conditions of being the Messiah, yet we don't hear them in retrospect ever having said that. It could be somewhere in their history, but we never notice Paul as being hailed as a Messiah. So apparently that contrast there is not often appreciated. So here was a man who was practically, according to Judaizers, the Messiah himself, and yet he walked away from it. So now we have Jews for Judaism telling us exactly what they believe. We have the former Jew of the Jews for Judaism, Paul the Apostle, telling us the truth about Jesus Christ. And we have the Jews for Judaism ridiculing the Jews for Jesus. And of course, I've not evaluated their organization, and certainly that'll be a fascinating research as well, especially in apologetics. So this is enough for now, but let us let the Jews for Judaism speak. Let us let the Jew of the Jews for Judaism, Paul the Apostle, speak, and then let us all contemplate the matter as it's presented before us, because right now it's so volatile out there. I have people very hypersensitive, which is very understandable in our world today, and the violence in the Middle East, and Hamas, and that which is now being highly disputed, the nation, the political group under the headship of Benjamin Netanyahu, and people are saying we shouldn't call them Jews, shouldn't call those people Israel. And of course the rationales in the Bible is just the sensitivity is to the point where some people are championing Judaizers as though they're true Jews, and that can happen in all the emotion, but let's back away from it, settle down, put our thinking caps on, get out our Bibles, and remember that the Jew of the Jews for Judaism renounced all of it. And we're speaking theologically and obviously accepting what can sometimes be disturbing when we're not always thinking, but they don't even serve the God of the Bible. They reject Jesus, the Son of God, the one in whom the fullness of the Godhead was pleased to dwell bodily, the one that revealed the Father, and those who believe in him believe the Father. If you deny Jesus, you deny the Father. If you deny the Son, you deny the Father. If you have the Son, you also have the Father. So this is very much renounced, ridiculed, and even the virgin birth claim is rejected. The Trinity is rejected, and the truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is rejected. So that can be disheartening, especially when we all can respond when we have appeals made for sympathy. Well, we have sympathy for any nation that's attacked. We have sympathy for the innocent victims in Ukraine and the Russia war. We have sympathy for those who were senselessly slaughtered by people like a terrorist group who attacked those dear people on October 7th. And we always have the sympathies for nations who, under tyrannical leaders, find their citizens subject to cruelty and harm and what we call the collateral damages of warfare. So you have a blessed day, and contemplate what Jews for Judaism actually believe, and they couldn't be farther removed from God of the Bible, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and even denying the virgin birth of Jesus. So you have a blessed day and enjoy this lesson.